Here's the fastest way to understand why the Civil War happened. 3 pieces of evidence and 1 big myth. Stay to the end for a 1-page timeline you can download. We'll frame the map of 1860, examine primary sources, follow the laws and court cases, and connect the economy and expansion. Then we'll stress test states' rights. The mid-19th century United States stood at a perilous crossroads, its future shadowed by an increasingly bitter internal struggle. Our aim is to illuminate the profound issues and pivotal events that inexorably propelled the nation toward its most devastating conflict. This exploration provides a comprehensive and informative overview of the pre-Civil War era. We will delve into the critical events, underlying ideologies, and powerful economic forces that collectively defined these tumultuous decades. Understanding the distinct geographical and political landscape of the nation around 1860 is fundamental to grasping the brewing tensions. The clear demarcation between states committed to freedom and those reliant on enslaved labor offers an immediate insight into the nation's profound division. The very contours of the United States at this time represented a nation deeply divided against itself. The escalating crisis was not a sudden eruption, but the culmination of decades of simmering discontent and irreconcilable differences. To truly comprehend this period, we must engage directly with the voices and documents that shaped it. Original records like declarations of secession reveal the deeply held convictions and grievances that drove states to dissolve their bonds with the Union. These primary sources offer an unvarnished look at the justifications and philosophies behind the separation. The printed press of the era served as a powerful medium, reflecting and amplifying the burgeoning national anxieties. Major legislative actions and judicial pronouncements frequently dominated headlines, signaling growing unrest. News regarding the Kansas-Nebraska Act, for instance, spread quickly, sparking widespread debate and violence. This legislative effort ignited fierce opposition, transforming territories into battlegrounds over the expansion of slavery. Similarly, the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision sent shockwaves across the country, further polarizing an already fractured populace. The ruling asserted that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, could not be American citizens, and thus had no standing to sue in federal court. It also declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, effectively opening all federal territories to slavery. These legal battles and political maneuvers underscored the profound challenges to the nation's foundational principles. Governmental institutions intended to unite frequently became arenas for conflict. Debates within the Capitol dome grew increasingly acrimonious, reflecting the deep divisions permeating society. The legal system, meant to uphold justice and order, instead found itself caught in the vortex of these intractable disputes. Decisions handed down by courts exemplified by Dred Scott often exacerbated tensions rather than resolving them. The very structures of law and governance were strained to their breaking point by the relentless pressure of conflicting ideals. Each legislative act, each court ruling, seemed to deepen the chasm between North and South. The foundational concepts of freedom and individual rights were interpreted in starkly contrasting ways. This fundamental disagreement over human liberty and federal authority fueled the march toward disunion. Beyond political and legal frameworks, profound economic disparities fundamentally shaped the trajectory of the nation. The Southern economy was overwhelmingly agrarian, dominated by the vast, labor-intensive cultivation of cash crops like cotton. This system relied heavily, indeed entirely, on the brutal institution of enslaved labor. The prosperity of the South was intrinsically linked to human bondage. In stark contrast, the Northern economy was rapidly industrializing, fostering a diverse mix of manufacturing, trade, and small-scale farming. Northern cities bustled with factories and commerce, attracting waves of immigrants seeking opportunity. This divergence created 2 distinct economic systems with vastly different social structures and labor needs. The economic interests of the North and South grew increasingly incompatible. Westward expansion, a defining characteristic of American history, exacerbated these economic and ideological tensions. As new territories were acquired, the question of whether they would enter the Union as free or slave states became paramount. Each new territorial acquisition sparked fierce debates and often violent confrontations. The paths of pioneers and settlers often directly overlapped with the spread of the contentious slavery question. Territorial disputes were not merely about land. They were about power and the future balance within the federal government. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act were all desperate attempts to manage this volatile issue. Each solution, however, proved temporary, often creating more problems than it solved. The struggle to define the status of new territories became a proxy battle for the soul of the nation. The relentless westward movement of the population carried the institution of slavery along with it, fueling widespread fear and controversy. The prospect of slavery expanding into new lands galvanized abolitionist movements in the North. Simultaneously, it solidified the resolve of Southern slaveholders to protect and extend their economic and social system. This expansion created an ever-widening rift. The conflicting ideologies of states' rights and federal authority were at the heart of many pre-Civil War debates. States' rights proponents argued for the supremacy of individual states in governing their internal affairs, including the right to determine the legality of slavery. This concept often clashed with the assertion of federal power, particularly concerning national laws. The debate over federal versus state power was intricately linked to the institution of slavery. One significant example of this clash was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This federal law mandated that all escaped enslaved persons, upon capture, be returned to their enslavers regardless of whether they were in a free state. The act compelled Northern citizens and authorities to assist in the capture, effectively extending the reach of slavery into free territories. It sparked outrage and resistance in the North, further hardening anti-slavery sentiment. The Fugitive Slave Act represented a dramatic overreach of federal power in the eyes of many Northern abolitionists, despite its intent to appease the South. It compelled individuals to participate in an institution they found morally repugnant. The enforcement of this act deeply offended principles of liberty and personal conscience in free states. This legal framework undeniably highlighted the irreconcilable differences in national values. The contrasting perspectives on states' rights versus federal authority created an unbridgeable divide in the national consciousness. For many in the South, states' rights were essential to preserving their way of life, including slavery. For many in the North, federal authority was necessary to protect the Union and eventually to challenge the moral injustice of slavery. These two core tenets were fundamentally opposed. The very definition of freedom and the extent of individual liberty were intensely debated, with the fate of millions hanging in the balance. The nation struggled to reconcile its founding ideals of liberty with the reality of widespread human enslavement. Every new law, every political speech, every act of violence underscored this profound ideological chasm. The foundation of shared national identity began to crumble under the weight of these contradictions. The nation grappled with the question of who truly belonged to the American community and whose rights were worthy of protection. The legal and moral arguments over slavery permeated every aspect of public discourse. This deep ideological conflict, fueled by economic divergence and territorial expansion, relentlessly pushed the United States toward an inevitable confrontation. The stage was set for a monumental and bloody reckoning. The path to the Civil War was paved with a complex interplay of legal arguments, economic imperatives, and deeply ingrained ideologies. The nation's legislative bodies and courts were frequently the battlegrounds for these disputes. Economic disparities fundamentally shaped regional interests and political allegiances. Each of these elements contributed to an increasingly fragile union. The combined force of constitutional arguments, judicial decisions, and the divergent economic systems ultimately proved too powerful to overcome. The legal battles over federal power and states' rights laid the groundwork for disunion. The economic chasm between an industrializing North and an agrarian, slave-dependent South made compromise increasingly elusive. These factors converged, leading to the ultimate collapse of political consensus. The unresolved questions of liberty, equality, and national unity culminated in the most transformative period in American history. The nation's future would be forged in the fires of civil war, a conflict born from decades of division. It was a crucible that tested the very ideals upon which the United States was founded. The lessons of this fractured era continue to resonate in the present day. In one line, expansion made the question unavoidable. Politics tried to manage it. Secession made war likely. Download the one-page timeline below. Next up, Election of 1860 explained how a single map reshaped U.S. politics. I'll link it here.